All right, well, this is the final segment for our study of Merrily on High, and now we're looking at the last two chapters, which is when he goes to Walsingham, and then sort of his final reflection at the end. Last time we had hit upon the question about, well, what is Colin Stephenson like, personality-wise? Because he does a good job of describing other people, but he doesn't really describe himself. Well, I was thinking about that, and it's like, I feel like there was something there somewhere, and I couldn't remember where it was, and it's in the preface to the second edition by Gordon Reed. And so he talks a little bit about Stephenson. So basically the first two paragraphs of that, he gives kind of paints a picture. He says, Colin Stephen was the best reconnoiter I've ever met. Whether one was alone with him or in a big crowd, he never failed to produce a constant stream of wildly funny stories or shrewd comments on people and ideas. Only the sight of good food could halt him in his tracks. I well remember him at the end of a large meal in an Edinburgh restaurant, stopping just before the punchline of a particularly wild tale to watch wistfully as a waiter went by with a heaping tray of food. Not till he was out of sight did Colin produce the hilarious end to the story. The occasion was the funnier because he was playing truant from an expensive health spa where friends had persuaded him to go with them to reduce his weight. As Merrily on High shows, Colin was a mixture of genuine lover of the church with all its disciplines and a delightful lover of God's creation with all its beauties. In his company, people felt more of a zest for life, and when they knew him better, they came to realize that this zest was accompanied by a deep love of God and his neighbor, and a genuine humility. G.K. Chesterton said, "The humble man will always be talkative, for he's interested in his subject and knows what is best shown in talk." Although Merrily on High is a churchy autobiography, it is not introspective. Colin's interest was in other people, not in himself. Well, it's 1958, and Father Hope Patton, Alfred Hope Patton, dies. He is 73 years old, and he is the founding administrator, creator, everything, of the Anglican Shrine of Our Lady of Walsingham, the recreated shrine. Yeah. So it was one of those consequences of Henry VIII's big power and wealth grab from the monasteries and the Reformation. So Walsingham was destroyed along with so many other treasures and looted. And the ruins were nearby, the parish, the village. And when he first got there, he decided to recreate the shrine. There was still a kind of a stone medallion, I think, over the entryway of the old abbey. And so from that, they recreated the image of the statue, and first put it in the parish church, and then later had a shrine of its own built, a whole complex eventually, and had it moved over there to the shrine. So it says, the death of Hope Patton was as dramatic as anything he might have planned in his more theatrical moments. And he was definitely theatrical. And although he lived to a decent age, 73, he did, in another sense, kind of work himself to death. He basically had sort of three jobs. When he died, those went to three different people, not to the same person. It says, for sometimes he'd been in bad health and often suffered what become known as one of his father's turns. But he had all of his life reacted badly to strain and worked himself to a standstill, so that those around him had come to regard these turns as the vapors. Very old-fashioned expression. It was a very hot, sultry August evening. After a heavy dinner, we had a fervorino, I don't know what that is, in which the bishops, coped and mitred, were processed round the shrine grounds, singing Ave, Ave. The mind boggles at the number of times H.P. must have sung those words during his 30 years at Walsingham. But he wasn't feeling like singing that evening. Having given benediction and stepped out of sight of the congregation, He felt very strongly that a priest should not be seen at a disadvantage. He just collapsed and died shortly after from a heart attack, surrounded by bishops and guardians. And in fact, the idea that all these bishops are there is very much a sign of maturity for the shrine, because it's not some kind of eyesore and thing that people are embarrassed about. It's come to be accepted by this point. It's gotten just the presence of bishops there from England, not from outside England, is a big step in the history of the shrine. And of course, all of the guardians are there, kind of the board of the directors. He is one of the founding guardians, and they ask him to be registrar, or they had already asked him to be registrar. And so he finds out what that means, is that, in a case like this, that means I have to step up and facilitate the next step and kind of be the leader. When we lose basically our number one and number two in the power structure of the board. So one is administrator and the other is, I forget, director or something like that. And then number three, I guess, is registrar. He says, bottom of 161, much later one of the guardians said to me, I suppose you know that when we elected you as registrar, we were conscious that we were choosing HP's successor. I certainly did not know that, he said, and if I had any suspicion of that, I would have been horrified. And then he spends a moment talking about the experience of a new call, which is hard to describe in some ways. I guess all you can do is just sort of tell your story, and that kind of helps paint the picture. He says, I was so entrenched in Oxford, I could imagine myself never moving, or he could not imagine himself ever moving. And at that moment, the church was closed, back in Oxford, St. Mary Magdalene's, for a complete remodeling of the chancel while we were using the chapel of Pusey House for services, which seemed no moment for me to be contemplating a move. And that made me think back to Father Sandy Herman and his story about he had interviewed and accepted a call to a new church down in, I don't know, Florida or somewhere. He was the rector at the old Cathedral of St. John in Quincy. And like the day after he accepted the call, the church burned to the ground. And he called him back and he said, I cannot leave these people in this situation. I'm going to have to decline. So, it's strange the way things move, and it's almost like this feeling of the universe is forcing you into this slot, and you're thinking, wait a minute, I'm a square peg. I'm not going to fit into that round hole. But, this tidal wave is just sort of reshaping you and turning you round all of a sudden, and you're going to fit. He talks about 10 years. He says, one of them, the bishops that were there, said to me, you'll have to come here and do this job, administrator. And I at once began to make excuse, saying that I had recently been told by a doctor that if I did not ease up a bit on my present job, I shouldn't last more than 10 years. 10 years, the bishop replied. That's splendid. It's the next Lambeth conference, and we can have the whole thing over again. So I guess that's why they were there, because the bishops from afar were in England for the Lambeth conference, so they said, well, let's all gather at Walsingham. So he says, well, my immediate task was to arrange the funeral, and it proved to be a very moving sight. We carried him from the shrine to the parish church, down the high street, which had seen so many festive processions. Most of the village followed the bier, which was surrounded by the guardians. Two of the sacred ministers were village boys who owed their vocation to his influence, and the third had lived as a layman in his community of St. Augustine and was back acting as curate to the parish. So a very moving tribute that those who carried him to his grave were those who had been fostered in their own vocations, in their own spiritual lives, and so on. He says, the guardians elected me as the master of the college, but this still meant that we had to find an administrator because Hope Patton had been both master of the college and administrator of the shrine. But he said, but the two offices were not necessarily synonymous, so he wanted to have them separate. He talks about his interest in having a monastic community there. I guess he mentions later on there's a sisterhood there, but he didn't mention that earlier. So I guess that had already been entrenched and well established, but they were really trying to get the monks going, and it just kind of never really took, you know. As soon as it seemed like it was going well, something went wrong. So he says they tried to put together, Patton had tried to put together a canon, a collection of canons of Augustinian monks. It says his thinking was that a holy place should always be surrounded by monkery. I guess that's a particularly British expression. He talks about how he had expected to get sort of a harsh treatment from the bishop because, you know, he'd heard the old stories about the bishop that didn't really like the shrine and didn't like Hope Patton and didn't like the whole thing. But there's a new bishop in town, and he's very nice and cordial and just very warm, and he says, secretly, I hope that we might have had a resounding row, which would give me a good excuse for keeping out of his diocese. In fact, I found him a charming, sympathetic old man who wanted to do what he thought would be best for everyone. I was much touched when he said, let's pray about it, and knelt down there and then on the carpet. And so, with a very sad heart, I guess, or split feelings, he tenders his resignation. And he said in the last chapter, as far as he knows, he's the first vicar of St. Mary Magdalene to ever resign. And then he talks about his successor. And, you know, I haven't been at a place to really worry about a successor. I mean, I left missions, but, you know, those were outposts that the bishop appoints. And also, you know, they get so many different priests in rapid succession. It's like, you know, these priests are a dime a dozen, you know. We'll get another one before long. It's of its very nature, kind of ends up being sort of a temporary situation. But I can imagine kind of the stress about, you know, your successors, especially when you invested a decade or more of your life into a place and you want to see it in good hands. And also you might be in a situation where you're not sure about the surroundings and you know, what forces might seep in and make ruin of the place, you know. And we've seen that again and again and again around the church these days, you know, of it only takes one priest to just turn a parish into rubble in terms of theology and usually everything else that kind of goes along with it. But he said he was thankfully very pleased. Father John Hooper followed him. He says he was a well-known Anglo-Catholic figure, but not a party man. This was a strange description. He says, it's his proud boast, this is 164, it is his proud boast that he never possessed a clerical collar. So I guess he just wore a cassock and no white part. I don't know why, because he seems like he's into all the other churchy stuff, and he's a well-known Anglo-Catholic, but I don't know. His appointment to St. Mary Magdalene was so right, it greatly eased my pains at leaving. Well, one thing I do remember is that when I was ordained a deacon and then started to put on the collar when I wore my cassock in chapel, apparently there's a lot of ventilation that comes through right here. So I felt like 5 degrees hotter thereafter. So I don't know if that's true, if that was just a psychosomatic thing. But I remember thinking, boy, it just seems warmer now. He also talks about how his move to Walsingham was a nightmare, just physically with the moving and hassle of so many things. It made me think about going to seminary. I think I had told the story in a sermon one time, but I had a bunch of hassles. I got a trailer for my car, and I was supposed to get a hitch, and then it didn't come in, and I had to postpone my trip an extra week, and it was like welcome week at the seminary, and I'm supposed to already be there, and finally the thing didn't come in, so I had to have one just custom welded on, and so finally I was on my way, and then it's going through Arkansas, and the road gets very bumpy, and the thing starts bobbing around, and the wheel comes off, and sparks fly all over the place, and it's bone dry in August, and the catches fire by the side of the road, and people pull over, some good old boys with a pickup truck full of shovels, and they start handing out shovels to people who pulled over and were helping out, turning over dirt and putting out the fire before the fire department arrived. Then they help me detach, and then I have to drive on to the next town. The next morning they give me a truck, so they move everything from the trailer to the truck, and then I haul my car behind the truck. And the last thing that was funny is on the side of the U-Haul truck, because on the sort of the more modern ones, they have vignettes of different places, you want to travel to. Well, guess what was on the side of my truck? A big green alien advertising Roswell, New Mexico. So it couldn't get any stranger. But I finally got there, and everything was okay. And he had the same type of experience too. He talks about how he's very busy, and he, kind of had second thoughts about, well, maybe I should have taken both jobs at the shrine and the parish too, just like Hope Patton. Even though I feel kind of too busy to handle it, it was almost easier to do that than to have a bad relationship with the person who was appointed at the parish, because they're just so closely intertwined. So he says, well, the next vicar is Alan Rowe at the parish of Walsingham. A vicar was appointed who did not much like having the shrine in his parish. You think, how did he end up there? But he found me difficult, so that the parishioners were faced with the problem of divided loyalties, which in no small place was an impossible situation. And he talks about how Father Patton had a tendency toward clutter, not just in his personal life, but he cluttered up his church with all kinds of things. And he talks about how when he was in Oxford, his main task was to put stuff into the church, put in shrines and whatnots. But his main task at Walsingham was to take stuff out of the church and try to declutter it and make it make more sense. But, of course, when you follow somebody who's so prominent, first of all, he's a hard act to follow. And then he said, it was, here lay the difficulty, because there were among H.P.'s female admirers who regarded the movement of a candle as treacherous. Undoing Father's work was a favorite phrase. And of course, I'm sure he heard that many a time. And he found all of the squabbles hard to cope with. He tells an interesting little story about he was the warden of the children's home and always felt that he hadn't had enough time to give to the boys who needed all the attention and affection they could get. I did not seem to be very successful with them, for after giving a serious talk to a boy who had taken money out of a box in the shrine, I cannot say that it had absolutely no effect, for next he robbed the Methodist chapel. He talks about at the complex there was kind of a retirement home that was being set up. I don't know if that ever turned out or if it was abandoned at some point, but there were two elderly priests there when he was there. The first, he talks about how he was much devoted to his old car, which he treated like an animal, often muttering at lunch, "I think I'll take my car out for a little run this afternoon," as he usually drove on the wrong side of the road, Those who went out with him said it was as exciting as a trip on the Big Dipper. I don't know what that is. Something that contemporaries would know. In the end, it was worry over a slight accident with the car which caused his death. He asked me to read a statement he had drawn up for the insurance company, and I felt bound to suggest that it would be better if he were to give one explanation and not three, each of which contradicted the other. It says this is charming, he was obedient to the last, for the newest deacon was with him as he lay dying, and when the prayer, "Go forth, Christian soul," was said, Tuggy, that's his nickname, just heaved a great sigh and went forth. That's a nice way to go. And then the other old priest who was there, Father Penton, he would chat away a lot without ceasing. And he said those who've been at breakfast would report Father Penton is having a talking day. We were always fascinated by the fact that he appeared to need different spectacles for each course at a meal. Having sat down to the soup, he would murmur apologetically, "Wrong glasses," and go and fetch the other pair, which would be changed again when the meat was served. And then he talks a little bit about Father Fynes Clinton, who was at St. Magnus the Martyr in London. This is right off of London Bridge. And it's a well-known parish and very, not just Anglo-Catholic, but I don't know if the parish is still this way, but he was very much an Anglo-Papalist, a kind of a founding figure in the Anglo-Papalist movement. Now, what's the difference, you ask? Well, first of all, you can have a different perspective on the Pope. So there were some Anglo-Catholics that were kind of like Orthodox in the sense that they were very kind of anti-papal, just almost kind of a personal thing, just grumble, less than doctrine. Some of them were more concerned with doctrine, that the papacy has usurped the proper government of the church and that sort of thing. But a lot of Anglo-Catholics didn't have any problem with the Pope. So what ends up being, for me, and I read a whole book about this by Yelton, and he says the fundamental difference in ecclesiology between the two was the Anglo-Papalists saw that at the Reformation, the true church had bifurcated. So the true church was both the established church and also the underground Catholic, what they call them, recusants, something like that. Whereas the Anglo-Catholics said, no, the true church was the established church. And so the underground Roman Catholics were schismatic, along with all the other nonconformists. So that was basically a fundamental ecclesiological distinction between the two parties. It's interesting that the Anglo-Papalist position actually has come to be more won out among the masses than the Anglo-Catholic position. He was quite a figure. He says, I first set eyes on him when I was a boy. Having heard of his very extreme church in the city of London, I found my way to St. Magnus and discovered the devotion of the 40 hours in progress. Have we ever done that here, by the way? Do you know?
I don't think so.
Probably more of a inner city kind of thing. But I looked it up and it said that it's obviously for 40 hours. Supposedly 40 hours was the amount of time that Christ was in the tomb. And also, of course, there's a lot of 40s in the Bible, so that's why it's 40 hours. And it's basically like the watch on Maundy Thursday, where it's just time with Jesus, and there's usually an introductory mass and some processions and a closing mass. And sometimes it's kind of spaced out between several different churches. So it'll be over here for a little while, and then we'll kind of move to one and move to another. We could actually start it here and process over to St. Matthias and finish up over there or something like that. I looked it up, it's about an hour walk though, so it feels a lot closer in the car than it does on foot, but for some young, spry people perhaps. He says, a lot of old ladies, many wearing blue veils, were responding ora pro nobis to the litany of the saints. As I entered, Fynes Clinton had just said, Omnes Sancti Angeli et Archangeli. And all the women shouted, ora pro nobis. A reproachful face turned from the altar and said reprovingly, orate pro nobis.
Yeah.
It's plural.
Yeah, it's plural.
Yeah. So almost all of the whole thing in the litany, is singular. St. Paul, pray for us. St. Peter, pray for us, and so on. But all the angels and the archangels, yeah, all of you guys, y'all, pray for us.
Okay. Okay, because in English, you is used for both.
Yeah. Yeah, so pray for us in English works both ways, But, foreign languages, and those genders and declensions and everything's got to match. And what a mess. I wonder, anybody know anything about Esperanto? No? Because that's like the invented language, along with Klingon. But I wonder if they employ gender stuff like all of these languages. Or if they try to do something extremely simple, or I don't know. He tells an interesting story about the ritual battles back in the day and St. Magnus. There was always a twinkle in those kindly old eyes, and he had thoroughly enjoyed all the legal battles he had fought with Protestants who had harried him when he first went to St. Magnus, having fought and lost an order to remove 6 candlesticks from the high altar. So you have to go through the church commission every time you want to do anything. Add a little something or change it or whatever, you got to get permission from the church commission because all these buildings are historic and stuff like that. And he didn't. So that was the reason why they could file a lawsuit, basically. So let me see. He had fought and lost in order to remove 6 candlesticks from the high altar, and through various courts he took off the elegant set and replaced them with valueless wooden ones. He then made the complainants take them with their own hands and sign a paper saying they had done so. This done, he put the original candlesticks back, and the objectors found that they had to start the proceedings all over again, and they lost heart. So he could be quite a sneaky one.
Who is this?
Father Fynes Clinton. I think his name was Hope Joy Fynes Clinton. And there seems to be a lot of English priests with hyphenated last names, and I have no idea why. Maybe it's like they want to, take their mother's prominent family name and include it in their own so it doesn't kind of get lost in the shuffle. Like the Walkers and the Bushes, but you don't see Walker-Bush. I don't know. Maybe it's just a European thing. So Fynes Clinton was very interested in ghosts and the supernatural. Actually, this would be the preternatural, I guess. He would often ask me with interest after I moved to Walsingham, have you seen Patton yet? When I said no, he would nod his head and say, several people I have, I believe. Talks again about the difficulty in trying to get the monks together and get them stable. He talks about one of the healing things over the course of his tenure there was that he filled in a lot at local country churches that needed supply priests, and that kind of smoothed over a lot of feelings and suspicions and made the shrine not seem so strange to the locals. He talks about one of them of a very low church. One Sunday, he had been out and he had not brought his surplice with him. So he says, I put on everything. So I don't know if he had his own vestments with him or what. But anyway, he put on the chasuble and everything else, I guess. Afterward, one of the congregation said, what beautiful robes you were wearing, Mr. Stephenson. I replied, I got a lot of these, so you can have a different set every Sunday, if you like. This was immediately passed around with excitement. Mr. Stephenson says we could have different robes every Sunday. After this, I always wore vestments without any further explanation. Oh, just interesting expression. What's the name of this? The rector didn't give his name. The old rector of Binham, an eccentric Irishman. In his rich Irish voice, he once told us that his church warden had informed him on Sunday morning that the diocesan quota had been paid with some money he was keeping for something else. And he ended, "It quite spoilt the Holy Communion for me." A phrase which I fear we adopted and used whenever something had irked us. That spoilt the Holy Communion for me. He talks about the experience of liturgical changes and the liturgical movement, page 174, about the middle of the page. The Reformation had caught up with the Roman Church, having been kept at bay for 300 years, but it was bound to react upon the Church of England. As always, when the Roman Church had a cold, the rest of us got pneumonia. Going over to Rome had become like jumping out of the fire into the frying pan. And it's interesting that second sentence is more an apt description than the first, because with the liturgical changes, it was much more severe in the Roman circles than in the Anglican circles.
What was that? It was more severe. What do you mean?
Well, like, ripping out things, moving the altar, removing statues, destroying statues, burning vestments, all those kinds of things. Just drastic overnight changes.
That Rome dictated?
Well, I think it's a result of ultramontanist kind of viewpoint. Ultramontanism is beyond the montane, beyond the mountains. So it's like whatever Rome does, we just copy it. And, this is what's, all the rage in Rome right now. So let's go do it. And so people kind of got carried away. So I don't know if these things were ever really mandated much of anywhere. They might have mandated saying Mass from behind the altar, which would at least require you to set up a portable altar, what my friends refer to as a picnic table in front of the high altar. But in Anglican circles, so you had the Church Commission that kind of was a valve on changes to the fabric of the church. So a lot of that kind of got plugged up there. But also you had just a more traditional mindset, more conservative, not talking about theology so much, but just in terms of change. There wasn't kind of the same ultramontane approach that, you just got to go with the latest fad from Rome. So that was a situation where it just made it happen, but it wasn't as frequent, it wasn't as extreme, it wasn't as commonplace. So you can go around the Episcopal Church, the Church of England, all these places, and find plenty of eastward-facing masses from the 1960s up until now, whereas you couldn't find any of that in Roman Catholic circles until very recently, really with the Latin Mass. And I mean, you can't hardly find any Novus Ordo east-facing masses anywhere. Certainly not before a couple of years ago, but even now you don't find any. If they're east-facing, they're almost certainly Tridentine masses. Anyway, back to that.
Or a monastic order that has the Cistercians. They probably never did.
Could be. Well, the Cistercians, they're kind of bare bones to start with, so there's not much to take out and get rid of. He says, I suppose Anglo-Catholics were hardest hit because we had always taken our stand on the fact that we were a part of the Western Church, and as we thought the Church of Rome would never change, we ought to bring ourselves as far in line with it as we could. When Rome did change, the ground was cut out from under our feet. Most of us were forced to think again. which is never a very comfortable exercise. And I can resonate with that because I remember someone, priest in Illinois, telling me explicitly, we were talking about something, like turning around the altar or something like that. He said, well, when I was young priest, we were just told, do whatever the Roman Catholics do.
Whoa.
And so when they started doing things different, we just started doing things different. He might have taken that a little bit too hard because he's in jail now for molesting altar boys.
Oh,
So
yeah.
some things you don't want to copy. He gives a little funny quip here about people who tried to survey, the typical pilgrim coming to the shrine, And one of the questions on the form was, are you male or female? And many had just answered yes. He also talks about kind of what we mentioned before. The really disgruntled Anglican priests, usually, had always had an escape route by going over to Rome. And now they discovered the Roman Church doing all the things they most disapproved of in the Church of England. So it's like, my escape route is gone. I have no more excuses to kind of vent and complain and say, well, if I get upset enough, I'm just going to go down the street. And we joke about that in Fort Worth because the headquarters of the Diocese of Fort Worth, of the Anglicans and the Roman Catholics, are literally on the same street. So you can say, if I get upset enough, I'm just going to keep driving further down the street and go work for the other guy. Interesting, he mentions evil on page 175, talking about, the kind of spiritual atmosphere at the shrine. I am convinced that the power of evil is always very active at a particularly holy place, and I never cease to be amazed at patterns of behavior which seemed almost like devil possession. So I think he's talking about, just this uncanny sense of things going wrong and kind of inexplicable behavior being the cause of things going wrong. Is this the devil kind of messing around and trying to disrupt pilgrimage where people would come and have their lives changed and so on? And then he talks about sort of the corresponding side of that. There's this battle of evil versus good. Page 176. If the power of evil sometimes made itself felt, it was negligible compared with the power of good, of which one was constantly aware, for even not very sensitive people are conscious of the atmosphere of Walsingham. I could tell many tales of those converted from unbelief, instantly, like St. Paul, and others healed mysteriously by the water of the holy well. And he talks about the shrine kind of becoming more mainstream in the life of the Church of England. The diocesan bishop Lancelot Fleming was unfailingly kind and sympathetic and invested me with the astounding respectability by making me a canon. I was also elected by the clergy of the diocese as proctor in convocation, which was another sign showing Walsingham was accepted in the diocese and that I had accomplished something of what I set out to do. He mentions in 1965, going back to liturgical change, he'd been a priest for 25 years, and for the first time, he had a little celebration in which he sang Mass facing the people at a portable altar we had placed in the sanctuary of the shrine, and which has been in use, unfortunately, ever since. So I believe this is the one where the sort of backdrop to the altar is the exterior of the holy house. So I think that's the layout and the place that he's talking about here. He talks about he couldn't help but reflect on how much ceremonial had changed since his early days. And when you follow the new Mass, the Novus Ordo, so many things are greatly simplified and just kind of cut out. So for example, if you're standing behind the altar, it was thought, well, there's no reason to kind of move from side to side. So, people ask, well, like, which, if you're standing on the other side, which side is the gospel side and which side is the epistle side? And the answer is, who cares? Doesn't matter. Just stand in the middle. Don't move around, that kind of thing. So everything is greatly simplified, and so these kind of traditions and these symbolic meanings are lost. He talks about how his mother passed away during this time, page 178. He says that the place where she was being taken care of, they thought about getting a priest to come visit, but they were unsure of. It says, "I fear our simple services will not be to your taste, Mrs. Stephenson." My mother said to me ingenuously, "I can't think of what made him say that." I pointed out that her flat was rather full of photographs of me in a beretta clutching rosaries. So that's why they thought maybe she wouldn't be up for that. He says, "I was lucky enough to reach her in time and be able to give her the last sacraments while she was conscious and knew me. As I sat beside her while she was dying, I read Soundings, the essays of rather mod theology by Cambridge theologians, which had just been published." So I guess she enjoyed reading theological works herself. "It put many of the things they were fussing about in their right perspective, to be with someone about to face the ultimate reality." Well, I'm guessing when I read this, it made me think that he's reading this out loud to her. Maybe that's not the case. Maybe he's just, he's passing the time by thumbing through this newfangled theology book that he got. That's probably what it is. And then it made him think, here's somebody who's actually going to be facing this head on, and seems kind of out of touch in that regard. He says, "The death of one's mother is bound to be something of a traumatic experience because she is the only person who knew you before you were born." I thought that was very touching. If I could say the father, not only do the parents know the child, but the child knows the parents, even before they're born. Because it made me think back to right at about 6 months, I think. That's where they really start to pick up on voices and respond from inside the womb. And that is the visit of Mary and Elizabeth, and the child leaps in the womb and all that kind of stuff. And I remember my wife telling me that when I would get up and preach in church, she would respond to that. And she would not respond when the other priest was preaching. So she had come to recognize my voice. She still does that. Starts kicking every time I start talking. So 10 years is wrapping up. Then he turns to some reminiscences at the end in the last chapter. Hymns ancient and modern. A little play on words with hymns. So he talks about kind of the critical eye toward the traditionalism and the ritualism that he had been engaged in. He doesn't abandon it or dismiss it or anything like that, but he has a different perspective on it later on in his ministry. Well, before you get to that, in Oxford, it was very easy to restrict my interest. For naturally, the movement which bears the name of the city, had left its mark on the churches. I did once go into a low church, and the clergyman who was standing at the door said, "Dull, isn't it?" I agreed heartily till I discovered he was talking about the weather. It's always one of the favorite quips. He says, Catholic ceremonial probably is a little bit hilarious to those who are not accustomed to it, but he says, it goes the other way around too. Father Crary, if he ever sees this, was the one who always likes to poke fun at the low church practice of the elevation of the cash. That when the offering is brought up, just like elevating the host, the elevation of the alms basin, the solemn elevation of the cash. And I always love just the way his voice sounds when he says cash. So he talks about two experiences, going to Mount Athos and then also visiting with Pope John the 23rd. And going to Mount Athos is like going back in time because it's like the Middle Ages are still up and running. And they see themselves that way. This is basically the last vestige of Byzantium. They still operate on Constantinople time, which he says midnight is at sundown. I don't know if that meant like because of the time zone difference, or if that's like in Byzantium, that's how they reckoned the day, sort of like the Hebrew idea of the.
Starts at 1 a.m.
Well, I don't think it was this. He mentioned
Compline would be at midnight,
sort of like the Hebrew
sunset.
view that I don't know where it is. I lost track of it. But that the new day starts at sundown. Let's see. On page 182, he says Mount Athos, which is this peninsula that comes out from Greece, and the ridge to the peninsula is very mountainous and rugged and a lot of forest, and so basically nobody gets out to the not island but the peninsula by land. Everybody gets there by sea because that's a whole lot easier. There's many legends about this place as a monastic center. It is said to be the Mount of Temptation, to which the devil took our Lord to show him all the kingdoms of the earth. Some of the monks claim that God puts hermits there with his own hand to see if human beings could live the life of angels. It became a complete monastic kingdom and is still claimed that no woman's foot has ever been set on the holy mountain. And this prohibition extends also to female animals. This, alas, does not seem to include fleas and bugs, which breed in plenty, and one also hears a suspicious clucking of hens around some of the more relaxed establishments. It's always been under the jurisdiction of the Patriarch of Constantinople, but there was a Latin monastery there till after the Great Schism of East and West. During the Fourth Crusade, an attack was made on the Holy Mountain, and several of the monks were burned as heretics, an outrage which has left its mark to this day in hatred and suspicion of anything Latin. And one thing is for sure, of all the Orthodox who are very anti-Catholic, the people at Mount Athos are the worst of all.
Oh, yeah.
And not without some reason, but, time to let it go. He talks about he was visiting on Holy Week, and this is back in Oxford. He was part of the Fellowship of St. Alban and St. Sergius. This is fosters fellowship and friendliness between Anglicans and Orthodox. He says he asked an Orthodox monk there to bless an icon that he had bought. I thought he looked a little shaken and discovered he had no holy water with him, and the rite of consecration takes several hours. He returned it to me the next morning, having been up half the night. He talks about going out to Mount Athos on Holy Week. He says the monk, there it is, the monks still keep to Byzantine time, which counts sunset as midnight. So that's not the beginning of the day, that's the middle of the day. So I'm not sure what to make of that. He talks about during the prayers, he would stand in the stall and hold a candle and kind of doze off and wake up, thankfully before the flame had gotten to him and burn his hand. And then after all that, he says, after 4 hours in church, I was led to my cell by a monk who said, now we will repose for an hour, and then we will go to church. I wore a cassock and biretta, for if one is a priest, one feels very naked without something to cover one's head, surrounded as one is by monks who put a veil over their stovepipe hats when they go into church. They are supposed to never cut their beards or their hair, which they wear in a bun, and literally let their hair down for the anaphora. There are no mirrors on the Holy Mountain, but the vain do looking to still water to try to do their hair. He says, I found one poor little monk who could hardly produce any hair at all on his face, and at his earnest pleas I sent him a bottle of very old-fashioned hair restorer, which had very encouraging pictures on the label. He gives a wonderful description on page 184 at the bottom. What chiefly fascinated me was that here was the Middle Ages, to which I had always looked with such romantic nostalgia, still in action. And basically his takeaway was, I still find it appealing and romantic, but I have a more wholesome, well-rounded picture now, that it wasn't just without problems. And so he goes to talk about the problems. He says, the worship is rich and wonderful. One prays the Orthodox never has a Reformation, which has taken so much out of the mystery and symbolism of the churches of the West. Yet their outlook has got strangely divorced from normal life. I was thinking about that just the other day with the whole issue of the calendar, the Julian calendar. And I was thinking, do Orthodox Christians who adhere to the Julian calendar, do they limit that to church life? Or do they go around thinking that, so today is June 2nd. Do they go around saying it's May 25th in real life? Or do they kind of just segregate that as that's church life? And if they do, what a vivid sign of how your spiritual life is divorced from reality. So do they say, well, I know in reality, the calendar is 365 and whatever fraction of days.
It doesn't even have to be reality. It just could be the world in which I live. You have to recognize certain things that you don't are true, even though you don't hold by it.
Well, and that's
same-sex marriage. Well, yes, it's legal, but it's not marriage. Or
well, but that's another layer. That's another layer because you say, I don't accept the Julian calendar. I mean, I recognize that it's there, but I don't adhere to it. Not because it's no longer used around me. Well, yeah, that's why I do it. But even if it was, I would say it's wrong because it's not true. Because that's not how long it takes for the sun, for the earth to go around the sun. It's slightly off. That's why you get days off over the course of centuries. So it's like, Orthodox Christmas, is January 7th. But Orthodox Christmas is not January 7th, it's December 25th. It's just they don't think it's December 25th until it's well into January. That's the distinction. Anyway, I'm getting too sidetracked. So he says their outlook has got strangely divorced from normal life, and many of the monks were very lazy fellows who spent a lot of their time just sitting around. For Eastern spirituality has tended to regard monks as primarily praying machines. There's never been the tradition of scholar monks, which we have in the West. We were told all over Athos with great awe of a monk at the Grand Lavre who was writing a book. When we met him, we found he was keeping a scrapbook and pasting in photographs from the Picture Post, or Life magazine or something. And he talks about kind of a monastic decline, and part of their decline was a lack of community. So there was a kind of a revolt against the practice of having a big monastery ruled by an abbot, and so now they're kind of this skeet collection of hermits. They call it idiorhythmic monasticism. And then somehow this fostered this practice where the rich monks pay the poorer monks to wait on them, and they live in very comfortable apartments, while the ancient and splendid refectories stand empty. It is very much monasticism in decline, and it is significant that they have shrunk in numbers far more drastically than the older form of Cenobite monastery. In them one can see the sort of situation which led to the dissolution of the monasteries in England. Oh, and I wonder, there's a wonderful picture that he paints here. I don't suppose one would find anyone on Athos prepared to debate how many angels can sit on the head of a pin, but many of their theological preoccupations are of that order, and their intolerance has to be seen to be believed. Their old beards tremble, and their eyes flash at the very thought of what they regard as heresy. Time has stood still, and when they speak of something, it is often very hard to gather whether it took place 30, or 300 years ago. So there's kind of this archaism, and he ends up reflecting that, we live in a world where we are surrounded by a modern life, and so the church needs to live in the world in which it exists, and have continuity with the past, but not be kind of like a museum of the past, which is basically his fundamental criticism of what he saw on Athos. And I think he would say, he doesn't get into it, but I think he would say that you could have the kind of life on Athos that is both rich in its tradition and also part of modern life as well at the same time. In fact, I haven't even gone to look, but I wonder if there's like any monasteries on Athos that have, like live webcams where you can look out and see what's going on the Holy Mountain and life in the chapel and so forth. That would be a wonderful opportunity for whoever wants to set that up. And they're always getting new people coming in there, both, a flood of all male pilgrims, but also, you're getting people join these monasteries who come from all kinds of backgrounds and have all kinds of skills, and they ought to bring that with them. But they probably don't have any electricity up there. I don't know. Or maybe they do. Then he talks about when he's on his Roman holiday and he visits Pope John the 23rd. And there's a Monsignor who says, I've told the Holy Father that you're here. He knows about you're with the shrine at Walsingham in England. He's very anxious to see you if you can spare the time. He's like, wow, the Pope wants to see me, okay. He says, I had never before realized how the papacy is in fact a Renaissance court and is still carried on with much of its splendor. And he talks about all that morning the Pope had been receiving cardinals in audience, and so everything was in full flower. We passed through room after room, filled with decorative figures in elaborate uniforms, Swiss guards, civil guards, gentlemen in waiting, noblemen of the Holy See, and papal chaplains, all standing around with nothing in particular to do. And then he talks about, I was getting a little anxious about the protocol, and he asked about what he should do upon meeting the Pope. The Monsignor said, well, we're supposed to genuflect 3 times as we approach the Holy Father, but you won't be expected to do that. And he probably figured, because he was talking about his wooden leg. But he replied, well, no, I can do that. I can do whatever I want to do the whole 9 yards, whatever it is y'all do. He said, it was quite right, because no sooner had I entered the library and gone down on one knee, the Pope pounced on me, pulling me up to my feet in a great bear hug and saying in English, get up, get up. And of course, this is very much John the 23rd. And it makes me think of, I forget who was telling the story, but when he was meeting Jackie Kennedy, and for some reason he was just meeting her, President Kennedy wasn't there, and John the 23rd was like, so what's the protocol? Because she's like, First Lady of the United States, and what am I supposed to do? What am I supposed to say? And then all of a sudden the door opened, and he just turned around and said, Jackie! So he kind of, all that went out the window. He says, talking about get up, it was very symbolic of the difference between him and his predecessor, that the desk used to be at the far end of the long room, so that visitors had to approach under close scrutiny of mesmeric eyes. But Pope John immediately had his desk moved to just inside the door. He led me to a chair and sat beside me, talking while the Monsignor translated. The Holy Father says he understands perfectly your position as an Anglican priest, but he wishes you to remember that you are already united with him in believing in our Lord and Our Lady, the Church and the sacraments. These are important things, and the matters which divide you are just not important. So he talks about just very much the warmth and generosity and caring pastoral nature of Pope John. And There was a warmth and joyousness which seemed to flow from him, and I felt at once that he was a very loving man who longed to give pleasure and happiness to everyone, and to him charity overruled everything, making him speak with a divine disregard for theological niceties. And he says, he'd asked about the shrine and what goes on there, and he had explained so many things about them, and John's listening on. He's like, oh, that's wonderful. And he took out some pictures to show him of the shrine, and he's looking at him. He's like, oh, Bella, that's beautiful. How nice. And he told him the anecdote about Father Hope Patton when they had built the shrine, and the Bishop of Norwich, the local bishop, of course, objected to the whole thing from start to finish. He was annoyed by it. And also he objected that when they built the building, they did a foundation stone with a inscription engraved in it. And it said, that this was constructed in the year whatever, when Pius XI was Pope, Bertram was Bishop of Norwich, and Hope Patton, parish priest of Walsingham. And so he got very upset when he saw that, and he's like, take that off of there. Take his name off of there. And so the climax of the story is that the final solution in heeding the bishop's request was to remove the name of the Bishop of Norwich, not the name of Pope Pius XI. And he says, when John the 23rd heard this, he threw back his head and roared with uninhibited laughter. And he talked about how the Anglican Shrine had an important work to do in helping heal the divisions between Anglicans and Catholics. He talked about, I've been with him for almost 3/4 of an hour when he opened the drawers of his desk and gave me a splendid bronze medal of himself in a small case, apologizing that it was not of a more precious metal. He then began to give me piles of medals and rosaries, which he had blessed for me to distribute amongst my friends, so that I felt like the children of Israel spoiling the Egyptians, which made him laugh. With extraordinary sensitivity, he said, I must find some white rosaries for your sisters. Now tell me their names. And he counted out the sets of beads, out one by one, repeating the names of each of the sisters as I told him. It was an act of imaginative charity to send a personal greeting to nuns of another communion in this graceful way. And then as they're parting, he said, Stephenson said, may I take your blessing to those who work for the Anglican Shrine? And he replied, choosing his words very carefully, I would wish my blessing to descend on all who visit your shrine. Then after a pause, he added, not as exerting authority, but in all charity. And he repeated, in all charity, 3 times. Before I left, he told me he would offer his Mass in office for me and my work the following day, and hoped that I would write him. He never says if they did have correspondence after that or not. He said the way to do it, don't send it to me, send it to Monsignor so-and-so here, and he will get it to me. Otherwise, I'll get lost, like writing Santa Claus or something. He talks about the hospitality he experienced in Europe when he would take groups to Lourdes, and they would always give the Anglican priests access to the altars there for their own tour groups and pilgrim groups and things like that. And you find that's the case all over Europe. That's very nice. And in the Holy Land too, I think. We have sort of special designated which ones we can use, and because they're very sensitive to that, especially in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and things like that. I forget who it is that we get to share with at that place. Some kind of small group. I forget who it is. I think we have an altar that's like up in the attic somewhere, so up at the top of the building. And he has a wonderful way to close it all down and bring it to a close. Oh, and his lesson from visiting with Pope John was about how we shouldn't let our tradition get us too stuffy, and we shouldn't lose sight of the important things, generosity and charity and that kind of thing. He closes with this paragraph. I do not now believe there ever was any hope of converting the Church of England as a whole to Baroque Catholicism, but I am glad to have lived at a time when for a moment it seemed a dizzy possibility. I am glad that I experienced something of the splendor of its worship and the tortuous complexities of its disciplines, and never for a moment do I regret the day on which I first pushed open the door of St. Bartholomew's, Brighton, and there and then formed an attitude to Anglicanism to which I shall react emotionally till the day of my death. You know, I'm not sure where I ever first came across Anglo-Catholicism. I don't remember. It's probably in the library, in books, because I would go up in Baylor, and I had to be careful whenever I went to the library, because if I went to the library, I would just stay there until they closed, which is like 1 o'clock in the morning. I'd never get anything accomplished there except just browsing and learning stuff on my own. But they had all the Anglo-Catholic Congress papers and all these kinds of neat things, and just kind of fell in love with it there. I was in the Diocese of Texas, which is low church area. So I don't know where I first got exposed to that, or who knows. Interesting. Well, thank you for joining us for this study of Colin Stephenson's Merrily on High.